The summer of 1976 in Pine Grove, Oregon, was unusually hot. Record-breaking temperatures baked the small logging town, nestled between ancient forests and rolling hills. Music from Fleetwood Mac and the Eagles played loudly from wood-paneled station wagons as people drove around. President Ford was campaigning against a peanut farmer from Georgia. The celebrations for the bicentennial had just wrapped up, leaving red, white, and blue bunting hanging loosely from storefronts. On the morning of July 18th, Patricia Miller enjoyed a cup of coffee on the front porch of the Pine Grove Inn, the bed and breakfast she managed just off Route 47. The air was heavy with humidity when a cream-colored Cadillac Eldorado pulled into the gravel parking lot. The license plate was from Illinois, and Patricia made a mental note to mention it to Sheriff Dawson when he stopped by for his usual afternoon coffee. Visitors from out of state were a rare sight in Pine Grove. Two young women stepped out of the Cadillac, dressed in matching pale blue dresses and white cardigans, despite the heat. Both had copper-colored hair styled in identical feathered cuts that framed their delicate faces. They looked like the wholesome beauties often seen on magazine covers. The taller one smiled warmly at Patricia as they approached, introducing herself and her sister. "Good morning, I'm Elizabeth Crowley, and this is my sister, Catherine. We have a reservation for the honeymoon suite." Patricia checked her reservation book. "Of course, Mrs. Crowley. And where are your husbands?" Elizabeth smiled without hesitation. "They'll be arriving later today. They had business in Portland, so we thought we'd get settled in first." The Crowley sisters paid for 2 weeks in advance with crisp $20 bills from a thick envelope and carried matching Samsonite luggage to the inn's most expensive room. It was the one with the king-sized four-poster bed and a view of the mountains. Patricia never saw their husbands arrive. 2 weeks later, on August 1st, Patricia entered the honeymoon suite after the sisters checked out. The room was spotless, not a single item out of place. It was the cleanest she'd ever seen a room left by departing guests, as if no one had ever stayed there at all. 3 days later, about 57 miles away, a group of teenagers drinking beer by the Willamette River made a disturbing discovery. Bobby Thompson, a 17-year-old, approached a fallen tree trunk and saw a human torso badly decomposed, missing its head and limbs. Nearby, a plastic bag held a wallet, car keys, and a wedding ring. The wallet contained identification for James Harrison, a 35-year-old banker from Chicago. This discovery marked the start of a chilling case that would become the most horrifying in Oregon's history, one that would remain unsolved for nearly 4 decades. Sheriff Walter Dawson, who had been with Pine Grove's small police force for 20 years, arrived at the riverbank just 22 minutes after Bobby's panicked call from a gas station payphone. Dawson had never seen anything like it. He immediately radioed for backup from the county coroner and Oregon State Police. "We're going to need to search the whole river," he told Deputy Lewis, his face pale beneath his broad-brimmed hat. The sun beat down relentlessly as they set up yellow police tape around the area. Dr. Morris, the county coroner, arrived soon after. He examined the torso and grimly reported, "Male, approximately 30 to 40 years old, dead for at least 2 weeks." He lowered his voice. "The genitals have been surgically removed." An hour later, state police arrived with additional officers and equipment. They scoured the river and found 4 more partial remains in the next 72 hours. Each body had the same surgical removal of the genitals, and each came with a plastic bag containing personal effects and identification. The victims were Thomas Miller, 38, William Peterson, 43, and Robert Johnson, 36. All successful businessmen from the Chicago area, and all recently married. Investigators contacted Illinois authorities. Each of the men had told their friends and family they were going on a honeymoon to the Pacific Northwest, but none of them had been heard from since. Fingerprints found in the Pine Grove Inn's reservation book matched partial prints found on the plastic bags with the victims' belongings. They belonged to Elizabeth and Catherine Crowley, aged 24 and 22. Pine Grove had never experienced a case like this before. The serial killers were 2 young women who seemed more like characters from the Partridge Family than dangerous criminals. The investigation started quickly, but the limitations of the time made it difficult to gather evidence. Long-distance calls to Chicago revealed that the Crowley sisters had been operating there for at least 6 months, targeting wealthy businessmen. Their method was the same. They would meet single men, create whirlwind romances, and marry them in secret ceremonies without any family present. After the weddings, they'd convince their husbands to take honeymoons to Oregon. The sisters' backgrounds were hard to trace. They were born in a small Kentucky town, but the trail went cold after they left home as teenagers. The town's archives revealed that their parents had died in a house fire when the girls were young. Former neighbors described them as unusually close, odd but polite. Sheriff Dawson and State Police Lieutenant Frank Richards set up a command center in the Pine Grove Town Hall. Soon, the walls were covered with photos, notes, and a large map marking where the bodies had been found. A dedicated tip line was set up, and local TV stations ran nightly updates, now calling the murders the Honeymoon killings. The investigation was tough without computers or DNA testing. Investigators relied on fingerprint comparisons, eyewitness reports, and physical evidence. The sisters had paid in cash everywhere, leaving little paper trail. Their Cadillac was found abandoned at Portland International Airport, wiped clean of fingerprints. Flight records showed no passengers matching their descriptions leaving Portland. In late August, Lieutenant Richards received shocking news from Chicago Police Detective Sam Ramirez. "We found their apartment," Ramirez said. "You won't believe this, Frank." The apartment rented by the Crowley sisters contained a makeshift operating room with a kitchen table covered in plastic, medical tools neatly arranged, and Polaroid photos of each victim before and after their mutilation. There was also a 47-page manifesto about punishing men for perceived wrongs against women, tied to something about their father. Ramirez's voice trembled as he spoke about the disturbing contents of the apartment. By October, 2 more bodies were found in remote Oregon locations, bringing the total to 7. All victims showed the same surgical precision. All were successful, wealthy men who had unknowingly married the sisters. The women had carefully planned each murder, luring their victims with promises of love, drugging them, performing horrific surgeries, and dismembering their bodies. Despite a nationwide manhunt, the Crowley sisters disappeared without a trace. Their faces were posted at every post office across the country, and their story was covered on television crime programs. But no solid sightings came in. As 1977 turned into 1978, the case faded from the headlines. Sheriff Dawson continued following leads, making calls from his office, where the sound of his electric typewriter and the rotary phone became his constant companions. He started smoking 2 packs of Marlboro cigarettes a day, his wife later recalled. The Crowley sisters had gotten under his skin. But as the years went by with no new evidence, even Dawson had to admit they had hit a dead end. Without modern forensics or national databases, they were working in the dark. On the 5th anniversary of the discoveries, he told a reporter, "But I promise you this, I will never stop looking for them. Those women will face justice if it's the last thing I do." The case files were eventually packed up and stored in cardboard boxes, marked in black ink and placed in the basement of the Pine Grove Police Department. 7 men had been brutally murdered, their bodies desecrated, their families left devastated, and the killers had vanished. As the 70s passed into the 80s, Pine Grove returned to normal, but the murders remained a local legend. By 1984, Sheriff Dawson had retired and moved to Arizona with his wife, though he continued calling the department for updates every month. Unfortunately, there were never any. Over the years, through the Reagan era, the rise of MTV, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the beginning of the Internet age, the Crowley sisters became nothing more than ghosts. The families of the victims struggled to move forward, but the lack of closure haunted them. Memorial services were held every year in Chicago, but over time, fewer people attended. Eventually, only immediate family remained. Newspaper articles marking the anniversaries grew shorter and were pushed to the back pages before disappearing entirely. James Harrison's wife never remarried. Every year on their anniversary, she placed a simple ad in the Chicago Tribune. "James, still waiting for answers. Still missing you. Love, Margaret." She kept a manila folder with every newspaper clipping about the case, no matter how small, and wrote to the Pine Grove Police Department twice a year asking for updates. Over time, the responses became shorter, eventually turning into form letters. William Peterson's son grew up without knowing his father. His mother kept a small shrine in their living room, a wedding photo, a pair of cufflinks, and the Chicago Tribune business section where Peterson had been featured for his successful investment strategy. Every night before bed, young Michael Peterson would touch the photograph and say goodnight to the father he never met. Thomas Miller's mother held on to the belief that one day her son would walk through the door. She never had a memorial service for him, keeping his bedroom exactly as it was in 1976. When she passed away in 1995, her family found hundreds of handwritten letters to him, never mailed, stacked neatly in shoe boxes under her bed. Robert Johnson's brother, driven by the unresolved case, became a police officer and later a detective. He visited Pine Grove every summer, going over the case files, looking for something others had missed. But he never found it. The evidence from 1976 was stored in the basement of the Pine Grove Police Department. Fingerprint cards had yellowed, photographs curled at the edges, and typewritten reports were fading. Magnetic tape recordings of witness interviews were collecting dust. The bags that once held the victims' belongings had started to deteriorate. The evidence was preserved as best as possible given the time, but the passage of years took its toll. In 1987, a small fire broke out in the basement, damaging some of the evidence. Water from the sprinklers soaked through cardboard boxes. Quick-thinking officers saved most of the Crowley case files, but some photographs and documents were lost for good. A true crime book about the case was published in 1992, becoming a modest bestseller. The author, Martin Reynolds, concluded that the Crowley sisters had either fled to South America or died years ago. "This is a case that will never be solved," he wrote in the final chapter. The perfect murders committed by two women who disappeared into thin air. Pine Grove itself began to change. The logging industry that had supported the town started to decline, and young people moved to larger cities. The Pine Grove Inn, where the Crowley sisters had stayed, closed in 1994 and was eventually turned into apartments. The river where the first body was found became a protected wildlife area. Bobby Thompson, the teenager who discovered the first victim, moved to Seattle and refused to talk about the case. Sheriff Walter Dawson passed away in 2001, taking his obsession with the case to his grave. His funeral was attended by law enforcement officers from across Oregon, many of whom had never worked on the case but knew of Dawson's dedication to it. His wife donated his personal case notes and theories to the Pine Grove Historical Society, where they were displayed alongside logging equipment and Native American artifacts as part of the town's history. By the turn of the new millennium, the Crowley case had become a piece of historical curiosity, a relic of a different era. True crime enthusiasts occasionally discussed it on early internet forums, but no new information ever surfaced. The families of the victims quietly grieved, their hopes for answers fading with each passing year. Then, in March of 2014, 38 years after the murders, a cardboard box arrived at the Oregon State Police Crime Laboratory in Salem. Inside were a VHS tape, a typewritten letter, and a small black notebook. A letter sent from a storage facility in Tucson, Arizona, explained that the contents had been found in a unit rented by Elizabeth Crowley from 1977 until her death in 2013. The unit had been paid for annually by automatic bank draft. When the payments stopped, the facility manager opened the unit and discovered several boxes. Most contained women's clothing and household items, but one box labeled, "Keep Forever," held the materials now in the police's possession. Detective Marion Harper, who had recently become head of Oregon's cold case unit, watched the VHS tape with growing horror. The tape, dated December 25, 1976, showed Elizabeth and Catherine Crowley sitting side by side on a floral couch. For 93 minutes, they calmly detailed their crimes. They explained how they lured their victims, their motivations, and how they managed to escape. "We are recording this because someday the world should know the truth," Elizabeth said, her voice eerily calm. "The men we married deserve their fate. All men who abuse power deserve the same." The black notebook contained newspaper clippings, photographs, and handwritten notes detailing each murder. It also included information about victims police had never discovered, raising the total to 9. What was most disturbing, though, were details about the sisters' childhood that shed light on, though didn't excuse, their murderous path. The VHS tape and notebook provided answers that had eluded investigators for decades. However, they also presented a new challenge. The Crowley sisters appeared to be dead, having lived under assumed identities for decades. If this was true, there would be no justice in a courtroom, no closure for the families in the traditional sense. But Detective Harper was determined. These women don't get to control the narrative, she said. They don't get to decide when this case ends. Harper put together a cold case team to verify the information in the tape and notebook and to confirm whether the Crowley sisters were really dead. The team used modern technology to cross-check the vintage evidence. They began by digitizing everything from the original case files. Yellowed fingerprint cards were scanned into the Automated Fingerprint Identification System, AFIS, and faded photographs were enhanced with digital imaging software. The VHS tape was converted to digital format to allow for enhanced audio analysis. The manifesto found in the Chicago apartment was compared to the letter accompanying the storage unit contents using modern linguistic analysis. DNA technology, which hadn't been available in 1976, now offered new possibilities. The original evidence bags containing the victims' belongings were carefully examined for trace DNA, such as skin cells, hair follicles, and bodily fluids, things investigators in the 70s couldn't detect. The notebook provided names the sisters had used after their disappearance. Elizabeth became Susan Mitchell, and Catherine became Karen Mitchell, pretending to be her sister. They initially fled to Mexico, then made their way to Arizona by 1978. There, they bought false identification, established new credit histories, and built quiet lives in Tucson suburbs. According to the notebook, Catherine died of breast cancer in 1993. Elizabeth lived another 20 years, passing away in 2013 of natural causes. Elizabeth had arranged for the contents of the storage unit to be delivered to the police 1 year after her death. Arizona authorities confirmed that a Susan Mitchell had died in Tucson in 2013. Hospital records showed she had no living relatives, and her modest estate had been handled by a local attorney who didn't know about her past. Her death certificate listed the cause as heart failure at age 61. Records for Karen Mitchell were harder to find, but eventually, a death certificate was found showing she passed in 1993 from complications related to breast cancer. Both women were cremated, and their ashes were scattered in the desert, according to their wishes. They had lived quiet lives. Susan Mitchell worked as a bookkeeper for a small accounting firm, while Karen was a nurse at a local clinic. They were described as private but pleasant people who attended church regularly and volunteered occasionally at animal shelters. They had few friends and no romantic relationships. The two women owned a small house together until Karen's death, after which Susan moved into an apartment. The team found former neighbors and co-workers of the Mitchell sisters. None of them suspected their true identities. Susan was remembered as quiet, especially after her sister's death. Karen had been more outgoing, active in the community until her illness took a toll on her. Photographs found in the Tucson house revealed how the sisters had changed their appearances. Both women had dyed their copper-colored hair dark brown. Catherine had gained significant weight, making her nearly unrecognizable compared to the slim young woman seen in the 1976 wanted posters. Elizabeth had aged into a thin, severe-looking woman with short gray hair and thick glasses. DNA testing of personal items from Susan Mitchell's apartment confirmed she was Elizabeth Crowley. A hairbrush belonging to Karen Mitchell, which Elizabeth kept after her death, confirmed she was Catherine Crowley. The most disturbing discovery came from the Black Notebook. Later entries suggested that while the sisters had stopped killing after moving to Arizona, they never felt remorse for their actions. Elizabeth's final entry, written just weeks before her death, said, "We did what was necessary. History will understand, even if our contemporaries did not." The notebook also revealed the sisters' traumatic childhood. Their father, a respected deacon in their Kentucky church, had subjected both girls to years of physical and sexual abuse. Their mother, aware of the abuse, enabled it by staying silent. The house fire that killed their parents had been set deliberately by the sisters when Elizabeth was 18 and Catherine 16. They escaped one horror only to create new ones, Harper noted in her case summary. The cycle of violence continued, with new victims bearing the punishment for the sins of their father. With the Crowley sisters confirmed dead, Detective Harper faced a difficult decision. The case could be officially closed with the files archived. The investigation could end. Justice in the traditional sense was impossible, but the victims' families deserved to know the truth. In June 2014, Harper traveled to Chicago to meet with the surviving family members of the Crowley victims. She brought the digitized case files, photographs of the sisters in their later years, and the most important piece of evidence, the confirmation of what had happened to their loved ones. Margaret Harrison, now in her 70s, sat quietly as Harper explained how her husband had died. Michael Peterson, who had grown up without a father, asked detailed questions about the investigation. Robert Johnson's brother, now retired from the police force, wept openly when shown a photograph of Susan Mitchell's apartment. A wall calendar there still marked the date of his brother's murder with a small red X, 38 years later. "I always thought I wanted revenge," Margaret Harrison told Harper. "I fantasized about looking them in the eyes as they were sentenced to death. But now I just feel empty. They lived free for decades while we suffered. Where's the justice in that?" The revelation that the Crowley sisters had lived quiet, seemingly normal lives for decades after their crimes sparked outrage among the victims' families and the public. News outlets across the country covered the story, many questioning how the killers had escaped capture for so long. Detective Harper decided that while the sisters couldn't face justice in person, their full story should be told. With the family's permission, she compiled the evidence into a comprehensive public report, including the details of the sisters' abuse and subsequent crimes. "Nothing will be hidden," Harper explained at a press conference. These women wanted to control when and how their story was told. But the full truth belongs to the victims and their families. The Crowley sisters don't get the last word. In October 2014, a memorial service was held in Chicago for all 9 victims of the Crowley sisters. For the first time, the families came together, united by their shared tragedy and the knowledge that the mystery had finally been solved. The original investigators were honored for their work despite the limitations they had faced. Sheriff Dawson's widow attended, accepting a plaque on behalf of her late husband. "Walter never stopped thinking about this case," she told the families. "He would be grateful to know you finally have answers." The Pine Grove Police Department created a permanent display about the case, showing how forensic science had evolved since 1976. The display included photographs of the original evidence alongside images demonstrating how modern technology had uncovered new information from the same materials. The case became a teaching tool for law enforcement across the country. Cold case units studied the Crowley investigation as an example of how preserved evidence, even decades old, could eventually yield results when combined with technological advances. For Detective Harper, the case represented both success and failure. "We solved the mystery, but we couldn't deliver traditional justice," she reflected in an interview a year after closing the case. The Crowley sisters escaped legal punishment. They lived full lives while their victims were denied that opportunity, but at least now we know the truth. The families of the victims now knew what happened to their loved ones, and while it wasn't the kind of justice they had hoped for, it was still a form of justice. In memory of their loved ones, the families established a foundation to support victims of violent crime and fund cold case investigations. Their first project was digitizing cold case files from the 1970s and 80s to preserve evidence that might otherwise be lost over time. Margaret Harrison, finally able to hold a proper funeral for her husband 39 years after his death, buried an urn containing some of the personal items recovered from the case's evidence storage. This act helped her let go of the pain she had carried for nearly 4 decades. Michael Peterson, now an adult, began speaking to law enforcement groups about the importance of victim advocacy. "My father was reduced to a case number, a statistic," he would say to officers. "Remember that behind every cold case is a human being and a family waiting for answers." In Pine Grove, the river where Bobby Thompson discovered the first victim was renamed Memorial Park. A small stone monument now listed the names of all 9 men who had been victims of the Crowley sisters. Local schools included the case in their history curriculum, teaching students about the crimes and the scientific advances that ultimately solved the mystery. The Crowley case files, both physical and digital, were permanently archived at the Oregon State Police headquarters. The black notebook, VHS tape, and other materials from the storage unit were preserved as vital historical evidence. Criminal psychologists studied the manifesto, which laid out the sisters' disturbing philosophy and twisted logic, to better understand the minds of female serial killers. Detective Harper kept a photograph on her desk showing the original evidence boxes next to the modern computer equipment used to analyze them. For her, it symbolized the bridge between past and present, between the limitations of 1976 and the capabilities of 2014. She often told new detectives, "Cold cases are never truly cold. They're just waiting for the right technology, the right detective, or the right piece of evidence to come along. Never give up on finding the truth. The families never do." The story of the Crowley sisters became part of American criminal history, a cautionary tale about hidden monsters and delayed justice. True crime books, documentaries, and podcasts examine the case from various angles, some focusing on the horrific nature of the crimes, others on the sisters' traumatic background, and still others on the investigative techniques that eventually revealed the truth. But for those who lived through the case, for the families who lost loved ones and the investigators who searched for justice, the Crowley sisters would always represent a particular kind of American tragedy. A story that began in the bicentennial summer of 1976 and echoed across decades, touching lives and communities from Oregon to Illinois to Arizona. A story that proved some truths can hide for years but eventually find their way into the light. A story that showed justice, even delayed and incomplete, is still worth pursuing. A story that connected the analog past with the digital present, demonstrating that evidence, properly preserved, can speak across time. In Pine Grove, older residents still remember the summer when evil came to stay at the local inn. They recall the fear that gripped their community when the bodies were discovered. They remember Sheriff Dawson's determination and eventual heartbreak. And now, they know the end of the story, even if it wasn't the ending anyone had hoped for. The Crowley sisters thought they had written their own final chapter. They believed they had escaped justice. But in the end, truth proved more persistent than their deception. The quiet lives they built in Arizona couldn't erase the horror they had created in Oregon. The passage of time couldn't diminish the importance of the lives they had taken. As Detective Harper wrote in the final page of her report, justice comes in many forms. Sometimes it's a verdict in a courtroom. Sometimes it's the revelation of truth after decades of mystery. The Crowley sisters may have escaped legal punishment, but they did not escape history. Their crimes and their victims will be remembered. Their true legacy is not the violence they committed, but the resilience of those left behind who never stopped searching for answers. In that search and in that remembrance, justice finds its lasting home. For the families of James Harrison, Thomas Miller, William Peterson, Robert Johnson, and the 5 other men whose lives were cut short by the Crowley sisters, the closing of the case brought a measure of peace. Not the complete justice they had once imagined, but an end to wondering, an end to the cruel limbo of not knowing. And perhaps, in the final accounting, that knowledge is its own form of justice. The truth delayed, but not denied. The mystery solved at last. The long silence finally broken.